Thank you, Lynette.
Thanks, Lynette.
And thank you to Erica and Kalisha and everybody from the curatorial programs team who work very tirelessly, and also everybody from the AV team, because nowadays with the pandemic, these things that appear so straightforward and so simple are actually not that simple. Getting things together has all sorts of additional requirements. So just to thank them. There's a lot of work that goes in behind the stage, so to speak. So thank you for joining us. My name is Shabbir Hussain Mustafa. I'm a curator here at the gallery, and I'm so happy that we're joined with my colleague and friend Roger Nelson. And we'll try and take you through some key questions that we're grappling with, and they are twofold. As you can see on the slides, there are two parts to this presentation today. On top is the invitation of what we're calling Dalam Southeast Asia, which is a kind of a project space. And I'll talk a little bit about what a project space is, why we want to initiate it at the gallery, and what is the promise of such a space in relation to the study of the story of modern art in Southeast Asia. And I think as Roger will take us through, we'll realize how some of these ideas can be really activated, right, and thought about, not just in relation to art from, say, Singapore or Southeast Asia as a region, but also in relation to the world. Because as we kind of continue our work in the Southeast Asia galleries, we've realized that in a sense we have never been isolated. We have always been connected, and the story of art is very much the story of the world at the same time. But just before I get into some of the more nitty-gritty aspects of the project space, just to kind of help us recall what we have been doing. So the UOB Southeast Asia Gallery, which is, well, sort of where we are at the moment, is housed in the former Supreme Court wing, just next to us. And it's housed across 3 floors, levels 3, 4, and 5. And at any given time, we present about 400 works of art. And this has been really a kind of a sort of a foundational space for so much of the work that we have been doing since the gallery launched in November 2015. So it's been about 6 years in total. And each year what we do is that we sort of refresh or rotate over 100 works. So about a third of the exhibition actually goes through change. And I mean, if I was to use a slightly more stronger word, a type of flux, right? And this kind of a flux is encouraged because to highlight, well, many things, but 2 things in particular. The first is that the curatorium, so not just myself and Roger, but our colleagues at large, there's about 20 of us now, working across, I would say, multiple geographies, languages, chronologies, right? So it's incredible, the kind of diversity that we have within the curatorial team. As we continue to build our research, we also want to find ways to share this with the public in a very meaningful way, right? And so it's kind of trying to get at that. And so the rotations are part of that. But the second aspect is related to collections building, because in a sense, I think the collection here at the gallery, of course, is often regarded as quite unique, even internationally. I mean, it is a collection within a national institution with a regional focus, right? And this has been built not just since 2015, but I think since the mid-1970s. And that story, I think, you can discover if you just read up a little bit more. There's quite a bit of literature on it. There's also been a number of talks that we've organized through similar such platforms that tells the story of the collection. So in a sense, it's to try and also build some of these questions into the story. So in a sense, by about our 5th year into operations, it became quite clear that whilst the 100 or so artwork, so if you think about it actually, in the last 5 years, we've rotated over 600 works. So in a sense, what you have here is a new exhibition and another half. But we realized that this was also proving to be, in a sense, insufficient, because debates internationally had also moved. And these debates were particular to the story of how modern art is not just studied, but also presented and shared with the public. And so this was very important. And we began to have dialogues with colleagues all over the world. And one of the things that we realized was that many museums around the world, largely museums that have a focus on what we define as the modern, yeah, so I mean there's debates on how, and we periodize the modern. I mean, Roger's written an entire book on the topic, so he's better placed to comment on this, but it's sort of, let's say, looking at sort of the late 19th century across the 20th century, right? And museums, I would say still largely in the West, were beginning to think about how they can actually push their stories, because of late, and I'll come to this in a little while, there has been a movement to think about how the story of modern art as it is told can be made even more diverse, right? Of course, I think our position here in smack in the middle of Southeast Asia is slightly different, of course, from our Western peers, and so we are very aware of this. But I think there is a general consensus in the curatorial field that there is a need to engage much more diverse publics and to tell these stories. So how do these stories come about, right? And as a result, you diversify. I don't like that word so much, but you kind of it's a very corporate term. You diversify the story of art in terms of thinking about who has remained lesser explored. So just to give you maybe a couple of examples. I mean, one example which is something that we have in fact interacted with is at the Centre Pompidou, right, in Paris, where they have a special space called the Focus Galleries. And the Focus Gallery is quite literally located within their long-term displays or their permanent displays, right? And what they do is they invite perspectives from all across the world to kind of come into that space and inhabit that space. And as a result, say something about the largely Western canon that they are presenting in their galleries. So for instance, in 2018, the National Gallery also collaborated with the Pompidou to present Latif Mohidin's very acclaimed, and I'm so happy to have Kanaga here as well, the Pago Pago series, right, which focused on a very specific moment in the artist's practice in the 1960s when he was traveling across Europe and, well, what we today consider as Southeast Asia. But similarly, I think in Amsterdam, the Stedelijk Museum, which is also a kind of a mainstay within the story of modern art, has, of course, for the longest time maintained its permanent displays or long-term displays in its basements, right? So when you go down into the basements, they call it the Stedelijk base, which is quite interesting because, again, it's sort of a foundational space, but they also realized that this narrative was rather limited and limiting, and that the Stedelijk base couldn't overcome these limits. And as a result, they initiated, and if you look more closely at the image, a space called Stedelijk turns. And so in a sense, these are turns within their collection, which also highlight stories that aren't represented in the Stedelijk base. So for instance, you know, I mean, one of the projects that came out of it about 3 years ago, which I also saw, was exploring the role of the Netherlands in the Dutch Indies and the kinds of debates that were generated in the 1930s in Batavia, or what is, well, today, Jakarta, right? So in a sense, looking at these very difficult topics, times, and generating dialogues as a result of it. So just to give you a sense of why we also felt that there was a need to build a project space to engage with this. Of course, we couldn't jump into it because the history of the National Gallery is much shorter than institutions like the Pompidou or even the Stedelijk. So I think after we had built the necessary, I don't know what you call it, like the necessary kind of research and depth, we thought that perhaps converting one of the galleries within the Southeast Asia galleries, which is housed here, into a project space would enable some of these conversations to happen from our position here in Southeast Asia, right? So to not kind of think that we are part of the same spectrum. We are, but we're also quite different, and our concerns are quite different. So to try and maybe grapple with these stories. I mean, I think in Singapore too, this is not an exception. I mean, the NUS Museum, for instance, also runs a space which is quite similar. It's called the prep room, things that may or may not happen, which is a kind of an experimental project space that has been running for many years. And so there are similar cases in Singapore as well. So this is not an exception in that regard. Which kind of brings me to thinking about today's talk, which will follow, and it'll offer some incredible insights into the project at hand, but to also kind of try and maybe attempt a summary of some of the questions that we are grappling with. I mean, the first question is really, how does one actually go about doing this? So it's one thing to say that one wants to make things diverse and one wants to bring all sorts of narratives into this question of modern art in Southeast Asia, but how does one actually do it? So this is the first question. The second is to think about the collection itself. Now, the longest time the assumption was, oh, this is a collections display. So this is what you have in the collection and you're going to show it. I think that has proven to be somewhat insufficient from a curatorial perspective. I think we need to have a critical dialogue with the collection in order to understand why certain things are in the collection, why certain things aren't, right? And to kind of have that dialogue and to understand what are the limits of our collection as well. Of course, every museum's collection will have its limits, right? I mean, one does not claim to be comprehensive in any sense of the word, but to try and understand why things are the way they are. And then I think, now this is a slightly more trickier kind of topic, is how do you let go of fixed notions of what an exhibition is? So for instance, could we still stage an exhibition which is merely a conversation between, say, Roger and a contemporary artist, for instance? And I say this because of late, one of the techniques that modern art museums in particular have been kind of adapting or adopting is inviting contemporary artists who are really at the forefront of their field to intervene into the collection. So they're given access to the collection to think about the collection. And so the perspective that an artist would bring to the collection is quite different from the kind of perspective that, say, I would bring or Roger would bring or our educators would bring, and so on and so forth. So to try and maybe challenge narratives by working with contemporary artists. So to kind of think about what exactly is the format of the exhibition. And as a result, we have kind of thought about this idea of the small format exhibition. So I hope many of you have already visited the exhibition, but otherwise, please do after the talk. It's just 2 floors down. The small format exhibition is really trying to do that. It's literally a small space. And because it is housed within the larger rubric of the Southeast Asia galleries, it enables us to try out some of these more speculative approaches. We might fail in some regards, but I think that's the spirit of it as well, to try out different approaches. And as a result, the story of modern art becomes interesting in relation to present times as well, because I think curators today do recognize that our work must speak also to our publics, right? Whilst it is also really dedicated to the work of artists and what artists do and why do they do the things that they do. So in a sense, it's a place to prototype as well. And then maybe 2 or 3 quick points, a bit mindful of the time as well. The first is this idea of contingent on display. And for the longest time, we have always been very good students of art history, right? And I am a good student of art history. I read it, I enjoy it, I engage with it. I sometimes even write in its mode. But I do also think that the curatorial is slightly different as a way of thinking and as a way of working. And one of the things that we wanted to try and do is develop a space where you could bring in objects which have not really received the full attention of art history, and to kind of develop a space as a means to write the art history itself and share that process with our public. And so in a sense, this is also not new. I mean, I can recall a range of exhibitions in the 90s when, even somebody like D.K. Sabapathy was curating and writing, that the exhibition then became a space to write the story of art as a result of the exhibition. In most cases, the exhibition preceded the long format essay, right, and the big books that we see today. So to try and keep that in mind as a way of working. So we should not be afraid to bring in materials which have not been fully historicized by the scholars in the university, I think. So we have a little bit more freedom here at the museum in that sense. We are less encumbered, so to speak. The second point is, and I kind of talked a little bit about it already, what does curating collections-based displays mean today? Why are we here? Why are we doing the things that we are doing? I think this is a really fundamental question, I think, that many of us are asking ourselves. And I think as a kind of maybe a provisional suggestion, what I want to kind of propose is that, and we have been accessing this, I'm also happy to share that the two artists in question, many of the members from the artists' family are also present here today, so to welcome all of them, that to build more consultative approaches to curatorial work. And so in a sense, you speak to constituents, you speak to individuals who are not just in direct contact with the art, but also individuals who may present counter readings to what the curator is doing, and to build that into the project. Now this is a bit difficult because, taking criticism sometimes is a difficult thing. I think our institutions, our educational institutions don't teach us enough in terms of being able to absorb criticism, and I think that's something that we can maybe learn and do more of at the museum, as difficult as it may be. And maybe I'll leave it at that, but perhaps I just want to maybe lay out an aspiration. And it might seem a bit counter-intuitive saying this, because when you walk through the Southeast Asia galleries as they are, the story seems very clear. There is a chronology from the 19th century to the present day. There is very clear wall text. It tells you what artists are doing and why they are doing it at particular moments in time. But hopefully with a space like Dalam Southeast Asia, we can mess it up a little bit more, make it a little bit more uneven. And this unevenness, I think, can be productive, I feel, to show that history doesn't work in a straight line. Actually, history has eruptions, history has circulations, history has dilemmas which we can return to and think about, I think. So this is what I mean by a kind of a more uneven story of art. So in a sense then, the narrative of Southeast Asian art just remains a work in progress. You're constantly adding to it, thinking about it, working with it. And the biggest, I think, challenge and promise, I think this is very exciting, is how to share this with our public. And we're trying to think about this as well. Yeah. So perhaps I'll leave it at that. And Roger, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mustafa. And thank you so much also for all the dialogues we've had in developing this project. I really couldn't have done it without your input, and it's been such a pleasure to develop this exhibition alongside and in conversation with the development of Dalam Southeast Asia as a space as well. So thank you. And while we're saying thank you, I want to begin from the very beginning with some acknowledgements and thanks. This project really would not have been possible without the support of many people, in particular the families of the two artists whose works we're presenting. So I'd really like to extend my thanks to Wang Yi, Wang Jin, and the other family members of Chenchonmei, as well as to Boey and the family of You Khin, who are in Cambodia and tuning in remotely today. This has obviously been a difficult time to be alive, and a difficult time to develop exhibitions. And it's been a particularly difficult time for the families of both artists as well. In the case of Chen Chung Mei, I've been developing this exhibition while the family has been dealing with the artist's illness, and then sadly she passed away last year. In the case of You Khin, the pandemic has hit especially hard in Cambodia and in places like Cambodia. Boey, You Khin's widow, runs an extraordinary school for underprivileged children in the countryside just south of Phnom Penh. And you can imagine the challenges that the pandemic has brought there. So I'm especially grateful to everyone for all their support in the face of such challenging circumstances. Now, what I'm going to do today is not give you a comprehensive introduction to these two artists. I think that would be impossible in the time we have. It would also not be in the spirit of what we're trying to do in Dalam Southeast Asia, which is to really focus in on specific questions and dilemmas and challenges and issues presented by our research and by the works in our collection. So if you're here for a comprehensive introduction to You Khin and/or to Chen Chung Mei, I'm afraid that you will go away disappointed. What we will instead have is a more focused study of some of their works and some of the questions and fascinations that arise from their works, which point to the connections between Singapore and Southeast Asia, but also between Southeast Asia and other regions of the global south across the world. That is, other parts of the world that are outside of the West and that have also been going through the process of decolonization. So that will be our kind of thread that runs through what I'm talking about today. What I'm going to do is introduce both artists a little, and then talk about some of the ways in which their works make visible these connections between Singapore and Southeast Asia, and between Southeast Asia and the rest of the global south. But before I do that, let's have a look at some paintings. The work on the left by You Khin is the work from which the exhibition takes its title. It's the Tailors and the Mannequins. It's a view of a workshop or tailor's workshop in Abidjan, the capital city of the Ivory Coast, a country in West Africa where You Khin lived and worked at the time that he made this painting. What we see are two tailors who are busy at work, one with a large pair of scissors cutting fabrics, the other with a sewing machine, and over their shoulders in the background there are the mannequins waiting to be dressed in their labour. The tailors, as I said, are busy at work. They're engrossed in their labour. They're not looking at the artist, and so therefore they're not looking at us. We can't see their faces. We have no idea what they're thinking or how they're feeling. Instead, what we see, what the artist makes us see, are the products of their labour, the fabrics that they are working on. These fabrics in different shades, in different colours, literally spill forward from these two figures into the pictorial space between them and the artist, that is, between them and us. The fabrics become both the thing that invites us into this painting, as well as the thing that keeps us out of the painting. Both the source of fascination for us, but also the source of, in a way, distancing or repelling of us. What I think You Khin is doing here is dramatising the moment of his encounter with these two tailors and their mannequins in their workshop. I think that his emphasis on the textiles themselves is part of has an almost symbolic function in emphasising the exterior qualities, the surfaces of the people that he was looking in on from the outside. I'm going to be talking about this quite a lot today. I think that one of the things that unites, or one of the things that is shared by these two artists, who are in many ways very different, is their shared fascination with clothing and with the depiction of attire and textiles as a way of emphasising exterior qualities of unfamiliar people in unfamiliar places, and thus making plain that while they are fascinated by, drawn to these unfamiliar people, these unfamiliar places, these exciting encounters, they do not pretend to offer us any special insight into the unfamiliar cultures that they are moving amongst. So on the right we see Chen Chung Mei's painting Kenyan Chieftains, an extraordinary work which has been kindly loaned to us from a collector here in Singapore. When you see the painting in the flesh, if you haven't already, the first thing that strikes you really is the red, that crimson colour of the robes, which has obviously just captured the artist's imagination, captured her fancy, so that even sometime after her travels through Kenya, back here in Singapore, in her comfortable studio in Bukit Timah with a lovely garden and so on, the vividness of that colour is still very apparent to her. Notice also the ways in which she's had fun with the thatching of the kind of vernacular architecture around these figures. She's clearly painting from memory, from her imagination, not from life, not from photographs. And like You Khin, I think the emphasis on clothing, on textiles, on that sort of tactile surfaces that adorn the bodies she's looking at, has a sort of a deeper function in reminding us that this is the artist looking in from the outside. Oops. Oops, sorry. Go back. Okay. Let's look at two more works which in which the artists are doing similar things, even though on the face of it the clothing, the textiles are not so much the subject matter here. You Khin's painting of a hawker he saw on his wanderings through the streets of Khartoum, the capital city of Sudan, a country in which he was also living and working at the time this painting was made. Unlike perhaps many depictions of hawkers, the emphasis is not on the coffee that's being made and sold, but rather on the seller himself, the hawker himself, and in particular the incredible kind of play of light on the folds of white fabric that hangs from his long, lanky frame. In Chen Chung Mei's painting of street stalls, a scene from here in Singapore, one of only a small number of Singapore scenes in the exhibition. On the one hand, we get the sense that this is an observation from daily life, that this is again the artist wandering through the streets of her city and observing what the goings on. But upon closer examination, it becomes clear to us that this is again the artist playfully experimenting with composition, using this observed scene as the departure point for formal play. So you notice the clothes that the people are wearing. Everyone's wearing either a white shirt or an orange shirt. It's hard to believe that this would have been really what she was observing. Rather, I think it's a mark of her kind of imagination and her desire to experiment with these colours in the composition. Where just below these figures, of course, we have these incredible mauves and lilacs on the surface of the road. Notice also the line of laundry hanging from the windows above the street stalls from which the painting takes its name. Laundry is actually a surprisingly common subject matter in Chen Chung Mei's works. Here are two prints also in the exhibition in which laundry is the primary subject. On the left, we see two women from the Kalash community, a community of people that live in Pakistan along the border of Afghanistan, which gives you a sense of the kind of extraordinary range of Chen Chung Mei's travels. On the right, you see a scene from India with, I counted about 20 people washing clothes and hanging them up to dry here. We are familiar with the idea of the everyday as a subject matter for artists, and in particular as a subject matter for artists in Singapore from Chen's generation. But to take up laundry as a subject matter is a particular corner of the everyday which is very rarely approached. We can speculate about the reasons for this. Of course, laundry is typically a feminine labour, although Chen's family has told me that she was never the one to do the laundry herself. It's also, as we see in these two works, a collective activity. It's a corner of the everyday in which people come together and to make light work, I suppose. Also in the exhibition we have a range of sketches, works on paper and archival materials generously lent to us by Chenchonmei's family. And in this work you see the same, a woman from the same community, a Kalash woman, and the sketch is made in 1991, which is probably the date of Chen's visit to this rather remote corner of Pakistan near the Afghanistan border. You notice that the print, an incredibly complex, technically accomplished etching on paper, is dated 1994. This is quite typical of Chen's work. She sketched and took photographs quite prolifically during her travels, but it was back here in Singapore that she developed her oil paintings and prints on paper from these sketches and photographs, and also I think from memory and imagination of her travels. One of my favourite parts of the exhibition are actually some snapshots of clothes lines she took during her travels somewhere in South Asia, perhaps also in Pakistan, a couple of decades before this print was made. This really strikes me as, kind of speaking to her peculiar sensibility and eye. Who goes on holiday and takes pictures of laundry? Okay, so this has been a little meander through the common emphasis on textiles, fabrics, clothing in both artists' works, which is by way of introducing the title of the exhibition and some of the artists' common concerns, and also giving you an opportunity to look at some of the images in the show before we turn to talking about each artist's biography in a bit more detail. Starting with Chen Chung Mei. She's born in 1927 here in Singapore, and both her mother and her father are prominent families in Singapore. Her mother has important political connections, and her father has plays an important role economically. She studies at NAFA, the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. Among her classmates are people like Chua Mia T, and among her teachers are people like Chong Su Ping. She very quickly, however, develops a very idiosyncratic individual style, quite unlike that of her classmates or her teachers. To the extent that Chen Chung Mei is known here in Singapore, she's known for her work with the 10 Men Art Group, a group of artists, sometimes 10, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, who travelled around first Malaya and then the rest of Southeast Asia throughout the 1960s. It's less well known that the 10 Men Art Group was in fact initiated by Chen herself, who then handed over the responsibility for leading the group to one of her male colleagues, Yachi Wei, who, along with other male members of the group, like Lim Tze Ping, have gone on to enjoy much greater prominence and acclaim than she has. As I said, the 10 Men Art Group period, the 1960s period of Chen's travels through Southeast Asia, is really what she's known for in Singapore, to the extent that she's known. But this is not the focus of the exhibition that we're presenting downstairs. Rather, the exhibition focuses on the period from the 1970s onwards, after she resigns from 20 years of work at the Bank of China and becomes a full-time artist. After she turns her attention from travelling only within Southeast Asia to instead travelling across much wider geographies. In the 1970s, South Asia, in particular India and Sri Lanka, becomes her favourite place to visit. In the 80s and 90s, she travels to Africa on several trips, as well as to Latin America, Oceania or Pacifica, and beyond. She takes more than 200 self-initiated study trips during this period. What's quite extraordinary is that Chen Chung Mei does not hold her first solo exhibition here in Singapore until 2004, when she's already 77 years old. Now, I think it would be a mistake to think that that this very late recognition is a product of her gender alone. I don't think that she wanted to exhibit. I don't think she had an interest in holding solo exhibitions before this, but I think there were also, from conversations with her family, I understand there were also kind of sensitivities in terms of the feelings of her husband and the rest of her family as well. She operated from a comfortable and affluent base here in Singapore, so she had the economic freedom to make work prolifically without needing to think about earning an income from it. And on this subject, as well as learning from conversations with the artist's family, I'm also inspired by the work of my friend and colleague Yvonne Loh, who talks about Chen Chung Mei having perhaps proposed a new way, a new model for being a professional artist, one that doesn't rely on kind of public acclaim that comes through solo exhibitions. Late in her life, when she starts exhibiting, she continues to hold exhibitions, and her work has been on show here at the gallery, in our DBS Singapore gallery, since we opened in 2015. Let's turn to You Khin, who, as we will see, is a very different artist who led a very different life. He's born 20 years later, in 1947, in Cambodia, where he studied at the University of Fine Arts. In 1973, after graduating from this University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh, he moves to France for the opportunity to further his studies. At this time, Cambodia is undergoing civil war, so it's a good time to leave the country. While he's in France as a student, the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, takes power in Cambodia, and the genocide for which the country is sadly still so infamous sweeps the country. Most of the artist's family, he later finds out, are killed. Because of these circumstances, of course, after his graduation from his studies in France, he's unable to return home to Cambodia. And in fact, he's unable to return home for 30 years. For 30 years, he lives outside of the country, first in Africa and then in the Middle East. In 1977, he moves to Khartoum in Sudan. In 1979, he moves to Abidjan in the Ivory Coast. In 1981, he moves to Doha in Qatar, and he stays there for almost 20 years. What's quite extraordinary is that in all of these rather unlikely and far-flung places, he not only is prolifically working as an artist, he's also exhibiting his work. He holds solo exhibitions twice in Khartoum in Sudan. He holds 3 solo exhibitions in Doha in Qatar. He lives briefly in London and holds a solo exhibition there, before finally returning home to Phnom Penh in 2004, where he begins work preparing for a solo exhibition in 2009, which opens, is favourably received, and then the artist promptly passes away. As you can see, a very different biography, very different life circumstances from Chen Chung Mei. And in case there was any confusion, I want to make clear that these two artists did not know each other. They did not intersect in any exhibitions. They did not cross paths. They led entirely separate and parallel lives and worked entirely separately. And so the dialogue that we are establishing between their works in the exhibition downstairs is entirely a speculative one. Mm-hmm. You Khin, I should also say, lived for most of his life as a refugee. From 1977, when he moved to Sudan because he was unable to return to Cambodia, he was a refugee. Shortly after this, he was a stateless person without a passport, before finally winning French nationality, largely through the work of his wife at the time. And this circumstance, I think, animates his concerns in many of his works, as perhaps we'll see. Okay. If we look at the two artists' lives together, as I said, very, very different circumstances. I want to draw particular attention to one aspect of each artist's biographies, which I've already mentioned. For Chen Chung Mei, it's the incredible number and scope of her travels, and for You Khin, it's the fact that he managed, against the challenges that he faced, to continue to show his work actively throughout his life. Chen Chung Mei, as I said, in the 1960s, during the 10-man art group period, travels solely within Southeast Asia. But from the 1970s onwards, her travels extend far beyond this region. Her favourite destinations move from Southeast Asia to South and East Asia, later to South Asia and Latin America, later to Africa and South Asia, as well as Oceania and Pacifica. These trips were all self-initiated. Many of them she took alone or else with her sister or other family members or friends. The list of countries she visited may well be incomplete. It's drawn just only from the stamps we've been able to find left in the 13 passports she left behind. And I've already talked a little bit about You Khin's incredible exhibitions, but you'll notice that they were in rather unusual places. Places like the head offices of a petroleum company in Doha, or in the Hilton Hotel in Khartoum. And I suppose it's obvious that these rather unusual choices of exhibition venues reflect the rather underdeveloped infrastructures for modern art in the cities in which he lived. When he and his family first moved to Qatar at the beginning of the 1980s, Qatar, far from the kind of bustling global, Doha, far from the bustling global city that we know it as today, was not even issuing tourist visas. Okay, so having established that these are two very different people with very different lives, let's return to looking at some of their works. One of the things that they have in common, in a way perhaps a starting point for the lines of inquiry that result in this exhibition, is their shared interest in classical Khmer antiquity early in their career. On the left here we see a painting by Chenchonmei, which is a detail from one of the bas-relief friezes at Angkor Wat. In the centre we see two photographs of You Khin's student work, which takes classical Khmer dance, or Rabam Boran, and again the temples of Angkor Wat as its subject matter. This interest in antiquity, in the antiquity of one's own culture, in the case of You Khin, and in the antiquity of a neighbouring culture, in the case of Chengchonmei, was certainly not unique to these two artists. I think it will be familiar from the work of many of their peers here in Southeast Asia. And indeed, it reflects ideas that were circulating amongst artists, but also at the very highest levels of government here in Southeast Asia in the 1960s. Let's look at a couple of quotes that illustrate that. S. Rajaratnam, at the time Minister for Culture, wrote of one of the other 10-men art group exhibitions that the exhibition will serve to bring about international goodwill and understanding and the strengthening of cultural bonds. So in other words, there's a sense that the curiosity about the cultures of neighbouring countries within Southeast Asia was an example of the use of culture as a means of making sense of our neighbours and of our place in the region. Van Mollivan, who was Rajaratnam's counterpart in Cambodia, the Minister for Culture at the time, said that modernity should not be inspired superficially by Western ideas that destroy all traces of the past. It should bring tradition and heritage back to life. So again, a very nice articulation of a familiar idea that an interest in classical antiquity, like in the temples of Angkor and so on, is not an interest in some dead thing, some leftover of some distant past, but rather is part of the process of the making of the modern. It is the reanimating of the past to bring tradition and heritage back to life. Now, if these ideas were circulating quite widely and freely in Southeast Asia at the time, in the 1960s, when You Khin was going through his studies and Chengchonmei was kind of coming to artistic maturity through her travels with the 10-men art group, what I want to highlight is that these ideas were also circulating in other regions, in other parts of the global south at the time, other parts of the world that were also decolonising at the time. Let's look at two quotes from rather different geographies. From Baghdad in Iraq, a group of 6 Iraqi artists, led by Ismail Fatah, wrote in 1969 that the past is not a dead object that we study, rather it is a stance that goes beyond time. In the same year, in Algiers, at the first Pan-African Cultural Conference, the Organisation of African Unity articulated some of the key tenets of Pan-Africanism when they said that culture is the essential cement of every social group, its primary means of intercommunication and of coming to terms with the outside world. So just as Rajaratnam said that the travels of the 10-men art group would allow the strengthening of cultural bonds, just as in Southeast Asia there was a sense that culture was a way of communicating amongst neighbours within a region, so too Pan-Africanism, which we might think of as another kind of regionalism, was articulated very explicitly with these ideas that culture was the primary means of intercommunication. Just as Van Molivan in Cambodia, like his peers elsewhere in Southeast Asia, talked about bringing tradition and heritage back to life and thus making a type of modernity that was distinctly Southeast Asian. So too, Ismail Fatah and other Iraqi artists at the same period were talking about the past not as a dead object, but rather as a stance that goes beyond time. So with this, I want to sort of highlight that that the ideas that we study when we study the emergence of regionalism here in Southeast Asia, while they are distinct and unique to this region, are also ideas that circulated in different ways in other parts of the global south. Now perhaps you wonder why I chose these two particular examples. The Pan-African Manifesto perhaps is self-explanatory because both artists travelled through Africa at a time when ideas of Pan-Africanism were very much in the air. Ismail Fatah has a rather more direct connection, specifically to You Khin. As we see in this pencil sketch in the centre of the slide, You Khin met Ismail Fatah in 1988, likely while he was preparing for an exhibition in Doha or in the neighbouring United Arab Emirates. Ismail Fatah, for those who are unfamiliar with him, is really one of the leading and most acclaimed modern artists in Iraq, best known for this extraordinary public sculpture in Baghdad. We don't know exactly how it was that You Khin came to meet Ismail Fatah. Regrettably, he didn't leave diaries or records of the encounter, and Yu Moy, his widow, who usually has an extraordinarily sharp and good memory, unfortunately her memory fails her on this point. But we can imagine that it was likely an introduction facilitated by a man called Usam Gaidan, who was also an Iraqi, an architect and researcher, who employed You Khin in Sudan and then again in Qatar. The two became good friends. Now, Usam Gaidan was one of a number of Iraqi and other Middle Eastern intellectuals who lived and worked in Africa during the 1970s. He was a graduate of the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and he wrote no fewer than 2 books studying the vernacular culture, architecture and culture of Kenya and other parts of Africa. In the book on the left, which was written just a couple of years before he first met You Khin and became his employer, he wrote about how the East African littoral or coastline has occupied a prominent place in the trade of the Indian Ocean area since the early centuries of our era, and he spoke of Arab geographers who made maps of this region, which today comprises Kenya, Somalia, Tanzania and Mozambique. And why am I telling you this? Because I want to point to the ways in which there is this long historical connection between Africa and the Middle East, which was being reactivated or reanimated in certain ways by figures such as Usam Gaidan in the 1970s and many others besides, and which is also, I think, activated and pointed to in the works of both You Khin and Chengchonmei. And let's look at how. First, let's look at You Khin. These 2 paintings we see here were both made in Qatar. They both depict scenes of the everyday, street scenes, from his wanderings through Doha. On the left, the bakery from which he bought bread for his children every day, just down the street from his home. And on the right, the letter writers who would provide a service for illiterate people. Both the bakers and the letter writers are Pakistani migrants. And of course, historically, there's always been a large number of South Asian migrants living and working in Doha and throughout the Middle East. And You Khin, as a migrant, as the only Cambodian artist in Qatar at the time, was particularly drawn to those South Asian and other migrants, and thus points to the connections between the Middle East and South Asia. Chengchonmei, in her work, I think points to how her travels in both South Asia and Africa in different ways manifest in quite similar kind of concerns worked out through form, worked out through colour and composition in her paintings. In these 2 paintings, I draw your attention in particular to the ways in which again, clothing and textiles are really central to the magic of the picture. On the left, that striped mauve and lilac sarong that the man in the centre is wearing. Those stripes echo, of course, with the stripes in the background and with the repeated lines of the cross-hatching on the baskets that he's carrying, the huts around. Similarly, we see the same kind of cross-hatching technique in the work on the right, where, as we've already seen, the robes that these so-called chieftains are wearing in Kenya are really the sort of centre of the work. Okay, having talked about the ways in which their works, I think, draw ties between South Asia and Africa, South Asia and the Middle East, having already seen the ties between Africa and the Middle East, I'd now like to sort of introduce some thinkers whose writings have helped me to think through this kind of idea of connection. The ideas that I'm trying to explore in the show, and the ideas that have helped me to make sense of the artist's works. These thinkers didn't write about these artists at all, and two of the three of them, their writing has not dealt with Southeast Asia at all. And so I suppose in introducing them here and in drawing on them in the conceptualising of the exhibition, I suppose I'm trying to propose a bit of a speculative or almost kind of polemical kind of a gesture, which is to encourage us to look not only to writing on Southeast Asia and not only to writing from the West, which I think still is often a kind of a default reflex, but also to writing and ideas from other parts, again, of the Global South. So just very quickly, I wanted to introduce first Achille Mbembe, a Cameroonian writer who talks about a planetary library, which can help us with a task of deprovincialising. So he writes that the Planetary Library, which is an imaginary thing, yeah, it's not a real library. It's a project, a dream, an ambition, a fantasy. The Planetary Library rests on the assumption of the inseparability of the different archives of the world, and it will draw upon each of them while drawing them together. This expansive ambition another term he uses is desegregate ideas, histories, concepts from different parts of the world to draw them into conversation with each other, is for him a decolonial project. It's a project of what he calls deprovincialising, which I think is a deliberate kind of riposte to the perhaps more familiar idea of provincialising, introduced by thinkers like Dipesh Chakrabarty. Provincialising as a decolonising kind of manoeuvre asks us to provincialise Europe, to think of Europe and the West as just one region among many in the world. Whereas deprovincialising encourages us to draw on the artworks, the ideas, the kind of cultural energies of different parts of the Global South in making sense of the world as a whole. Okay, so that's Mbembe. The second thinker is Edouard Glissant from the Caribbean, the African diaspora, who talks about what he calls the right to opacity. Let's read the quote. He says that opacities can coexist and converge, weaving fabrics. To understand these, one must focus on the texture of the weave and not on the nature of its components. When he says opacity, what he means, I think, for me, is unknowability. When he talks about the right to opacity, he's talking about the right of people in the world to remain mysterious, to remain unknowable, to remain beyond the reach and understanding of outsiders looking in. So if we think back to those tailors in that workshop in Abidjan that You Khin was looking in on, they retain, I feel, a certain kind of opacity. They retain a certain unknowability or mystery. Their inner lives remain opaque and hidden from view. The last thinker that I wanted to quote is Ho Ho Ing, writing in the 1970s, but translated only late last year, early this year, through the good work of the Esplanade Visual Arts Program and my friend and colleague there, Linda Tay. He talks about the modern as being inherently, necessarily, unavoidably ungraspable. He writes that when you manage to grasp the modern, it has ceased to be modern. The modern is the shadow of a bird in flight, always moving forward. The shadow of a bird in flight you see is the vanishing of the old and the new coming forth to take its place. Now, what has this got to do with the idea of the right to opacity and the planetary library that draws the world together? I think that what I'm trying to get at here is that in drawing on what Mbembe calls the different archives of the world, and in allowing the unknowability or mystery or opacity of the people and constituents of those different archives, what we are doing is we are making sense of the world. We're developing a sense of kind of a planetary consciousness, and that is an essentially modern gesture. This idea of the world as modern is also articulated by both artists themselves. You Khin said in an interview just before he passed away that my world is modern. Chen Chung Mei said in an interview that took place over the course of 8 hours in 2008 that everyone is an artist in this world. She also spoke about how wherever she travelled in the world, the first thing she would do, if possible, would be to go to the museum and see the work of local artists. And she also spoke about, you know, her deep respect for not just fine art, but also, you know, crafts and you know, the kind of the art of the everyday, if you like, of the people she encountered in the world. So what I think we can make of these statements by the artists in the light of these ideas from Mbembe, Glissant, and Ho Ho Ing is that the planetary is the modern. The modern is planetary. So when we see works like these, which emphasize clothing, emphasize exterior qualities, dramatize the moment of encounter, while emphasizing the position of the artist as a subject on the outside looking in, what we see is the artist's curiosity about unfamiliar cultures, unfamiliar people in unfamiliar places, the artist's kind of planetary consciousness, if you like, traveling through parts of the world very far from home, very far from Southeast Asia. But we also see the artist recognizing these people, these tailors in Abidjan, these chieftains in Kenya, recognizing these people not only as unfamiliar, not only as culturally other, but also as necessarily and inherently modern. And maybe I'll stop there and we can have a bit of a conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, fantastic. I'm sure there are some questions also from the floor, but just to kind of get everything going, little bit mindful of time, so maybe we'll wrap up in about 10-15 minutes. Perhaps I can begin with a comment or maybe even a question, Roger. The kind of historical connections that you spoke about, that figures like even Ismail Fatah are speaking to, right? So Pan-Africanism, of course at the time there was also Pan-Asianism, Latin America for instance was also collectivizing. But I think at the same time the evocation of the Indian Ocean littoral, because obviously the sea lanes had moved ideas and people for centuries, right? Before the kind of I would say to a large extent the Western colonial interventions happened, and that kind of disrupted flows, but these continue to happen actually. It never really stopped. And I mean, my reflection is that with both figures, you know, fantastic individuals, I think it's amazing to see how a lot of these things that we often see and read about in history books actually became alive. You know, it literally became animated as well. I have a whole range of other questions, you know, on the textiles and the fabrics and the crafts and the interests in, even in the solo exhibition, right? What does it mean for an artist to have a solo exhibition and so on and so forth. But perhaps let's open up the floor to some questions. Are there any questions, if I may ask? It could even be a comment, for instance. Yes. I think there is a microphone which you can use as well. Yeah.
Hi, Roger. Congratulations, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's really fascinating to hear about these two artists and their sort of parallel and intersecting journeys. I think my question is that it's really interesting, the critical references that you've surfaced, and I wonder, what do these outlier kind of experiences and the push towards a kind of planetary perspective, looking at these sort of different wider narratives of travel, how does this sort of expansive perspective, how do you think that should impact the way we look at regional art history? And how would it impact the way we think about regional art history and the way it's being written about?
That's a great question.
Thanks for the question. It's really at the heart of what I think we've been talking about in the development of this exhibition. I think over the years, bringing people through the UOB Southeast Asia Gallery, there's often a sense that the value, the purpose, the utility of Southeast Asian art is to make sense of Southeast Asia. And I suppose one of the questions I wanted to ask with this exhibition was, is this still Southeast Asian art? When it's depictions of Kenyans or Tailors in the Ivory Coast, is that still Southeast Asian art? Also, perhaps to put pressure on Southeast Asia as a category, which, of course, as we know, the constituent nations of this region have gone through such divergent experiences over the past few decades, and I think you couldn't get two more different national histories than Singapore's and Cambodia's, and I think that's reflected in the biographies of these two artists. But what do these stories of travels mean for Southeast Asian art as a regional art history? What do these two artists enable when we think about a regional art history? For me, it's really thinking about the connections between not just the individual nations in this region as a region, but also this region and other regions of the global south. I think that Chengchonmei and You Khin draw inspiration not only from the changes that are unfolding in their homelands, although that is also important, but also from the encounters with unfamiliar people and places very far away. And as they move around the world, the ideas that they encounter, some of them are new and unfamiliar, but some of them, as I've tried to sort of point to, resonate with ideas and debates that were also happening here in the region as well. So I guess one thing that I'm trying to sort of say is that Southeast Asia as a region is not disconnected from the rest of the world, if that makes sense. Thanks for the question.
Maybe I can offer one question. You spoke about the turn to textile fabrics, clothing, and of course broadly the story of the crafts, right? And obviously during the 1960s, I think there were raging debates around this in different parts of the world, right? So that by understanding the craft traditions of Asia, you could actually understand a history that existed prior to the onset of colonization, right? That it was a space that had somehow grappled with the colonial on its own terms and managed to survive, in a sense. I'm wondering, Roger, and this I might be asking you to speculate here, so I hope it's a fair question, but how aware were both artists in terms of these debates? Were they connected and having these dialogues with their peers? Or was it a kind of a much more visceral link, right, to these questions?
It's a great question, Mustafa, and I don't know the answer. I can tell you that in Cambodia in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when You Khin is going through his studies, the place of craft within the fine arts education system has shifted dramatically from during the colonial period. Of course, the University of Fine Arts, as it was when he graduated, formerly the Royal University of Fine Arts, and before that the School of Cambodian Arts, was established during the colonial period as a school for craft, as a school to produce craft objects, in contradistinction from fine art. And that divide had been thoroughly dismantled as part of the decolonising process. To what extent that context during his education shaped his thinking, I think is difficult for us to say. Cheng, on the other hand, I think it's hard to ignore the repeated appearance of baskets, of atap huts, of woven leaves, woven fabrics in her works depicting scenes in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, and far beyond as well. She didn't leave us notes or records of her thoughts about this, but it's there in the work. So I think it's impossible to ignore. But for me, we've had many conversations about craft over the years, and I think it's an area that we need to think more about for sure as a museum. But for me, the appearance of these so-called crafts in the works of both artists is as much about painting as it is anything else. If we look at the two works here, the textiles stand in for the canvas itself. The textile, the clothing that drapes across these bodies is the canvas that is stretched across this frame. In working out how to depict these folds of fabric, these colours, the artists are working out how to paint. And so perhaps this gets us to some kind of a connection or a dialogue where the worlds of craft and the worlds of this kind of Western technology that is oil painting start to converge as well.
Two questions, yeah. Let's take both comments together. Yes, please.
I just wanted to ask, since you said that both of them are Southeast Asian artists, but they depict other countries, so what, as a curator, what is your definition of Southeast Asian art? Is it a Southeast Asian artist that paints, well, local, or do you also qualify those as Southeast Asian artists if they are foreigners, but they depict Southeast Asian scenes? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. I think I'll let Mustafa handle that one, but perhaps if Professor Sabapati would also like to.
No, I will address it. Yes. Please.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not going to answer that question. not that it's not a question of worth. I was quite thrilled to hear your very last comment regarding the pictures themselves. In both You Khin and Cheng Mei, in your introductory remarks, you talked about the subjects as topics, the subjects in terms of the content of the pictures. In one instance, it's the tailors. In the other, it's a gathering of X number of persons in a particular location. And you observe that we are not privy to who they are in terms of their faces and their appearances, but more to do with their labor. And secondly, to do with your last remark about fabric and the interest in fabric. And in fact, you've answered, but even as you were saying that, I thought there was a third interest in there, and that is the act of painting and the picture itself. All these come to the fore because a picture has been painted. And these two individuals, in their capacity as picture makers, have brought these to our attention. And I've not seen the exhibition, from the PowerPoint images that you have selected to show, with the exception of the two graphic representations, the drawn images, there's an astounding consistency in their technology of painting. And I'm wondering, in the theoretical constructs that you have set out, which were quite engaging towards the very end in trying to be as worldly as is possible. And as curators and as presenters of pictures in this establishment, if we could also from time to time set out to theorize on these levels via the picture, through the fabrication of the picture, the making of the picture, in other words, practice. I think this would be, and you are also involved in a very decisive kind of practice in with the artifacts that you're dealing with. And you drew distinction between the way artifacts are treated by writers on art, especially historians of art, quite rightly, and the way that curators present artifacts and then write on these artifacts, quite right. And that's why there are these differences. And I would uphold those differences rather than demolish them, because I think they have a lot to offer, a lot to offer. But back again, Roger, could the sort of travels that was asked and the Southeast Asianness of Southeast Asian art, which was implied in the question that was asked, could some of these be, however tentatively, slowly, but incrementally, be also brought to the surface by examining practice and production much more scrupulously than we tend to. We tend to talk off the picture, about, but all interpretation is aboutness, undoubtedly. But from time to time, can we breach that aboutness and tussle with the picture? You don't have to answer it, it's because it's a proposition. And I think the kinds of publics that you wish to engage in, I'm not overly enamored of the word inclusiveness because of this horrible politicizing that goes on about it in such a fake way here, but I understand the spirit of it. Could that also be engendered through these kinds of engagements, through practice? And so Cheng Mei's utterly privileged life, which gave forth what she produced, would provide an avenue towards seeing what she did, because she didn't have to depend on it for the kind of living. And then You Khin's, I don't know him at all, must have been a horrifically agonizing life, to be away and then to be home and then off again. So I'm just wondering if the practice and production could be the kind of nuclei for some of these things. I'm not asking for formal, a sort of salam to formality or anything, sure, but just looking at the work, the artifact.
I can maybe offer a quick thought before Roger can. No, thank you for both questions. I think they are, in a sense, interrelated. But perhaps I can maybe offer two thoughts first. I think the making of the work itself, and this is really the perennial challenge here. I feel sometimes that this is where the format of the exhibition, in a sense, lets us down, because we haven't fully found or developed techniques to highlight the very complex processes that go through the artist's mind before this aboutness of the image is put up on the wall. I think there's a lot of work to do in that regard. it may take us a lifetime to figure this out. But I think it might be a worthwhile endeavor. And gosh, even if we can crack it just a little bit, I think the story of art can become quite a fantastic story to tell, not just among scholars and historians and curators, but I think with the public. And so I think, no, thank you, Prof, for that comment. I think this is something we have to genuinely think about. Just going back to the earlier question about who is the Southeast Asian artist. Oh my, actually the Southeast Asian artist does not exist. We invented him, her, and they. And I think the Southeast Asian artists might be real or might not be real. But as far as I'm concerned, at least in as far as everyday work is concerned, I think the Southeast Asian artist is a kind of a figure who arrives under whatever circumstances in this part of the world where we are, however you choose to define it. It could be ASEAN or, I mean, that's the working definition at the moment, which I think we should abandon. I think this project abandons it in incredible ways. But it's just a figure who comes and stays and does something which is palpable or sensed as art, not necessarily in the formats that are prescribed by museums or by scholars or by curators, I think. And maybe that's the only definition I can offer at the moment. Yeah. Not a very clear answer, but that's all I can say. Yeah.
I think if something about the project makes the category of Southeast Asian artists a little bit unstable, then perhaps that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions and comments? Okay, so thank you everyone for your questions and comments, and of course Roger and Mustafa for your insights. And to help us improve our future programs, we'll be very grateful if you can help fill in the feedback form that we'll be handing out soon. And for the online participants, please scan the QR code, which is now appearing on your screen. Your feedbacks are much appreciated. So the exhibition is located at the UOB Southeast Asia Gallery on level 3 at the Supreme Court Wing. And we're open until 10 April 2022, so please do visit the exhibition before it closes. And for the ones who are joining us in person, we do have some brochures outside at the entrance to help you find your way to the exhibition. So thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you again in our next programs.
Thank you, Lynette.